Here we are with the second of the heart lectures, talking about the heart working as a pump to keep the blood moving through your body. In fact, the heart takes the low pressure blood from the veins and shoves them into the high pressure arteries. That's what keeps your circulation going. It maintains a low pressure on one side and maintains a high pressure on the other, so the blood keeps going in the right direction. So here, from last time, here's our heart with the right and left atria, the right and left ventricles, the tricuspid and mitral valves, the aortic valve, pulmonic valve is up in there, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava coming from down there. Here we have the aorta, the aortic arch here, left ventricle, right ventricle, big powerful left ventricle, the interventricular septum. You can see the SA node and AV node, bundle of His, left and right bundle branches, Purkinje fibers, papillary muscles, all of these structures that you're going to need to know for the lab practical exam, and so that you know what's going on when we talk about how the heart is working. Here we have the blood flow, which we did last time. Always good to review this. Comes in through the vena cava, into the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, etc., 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 all the way through the body and then back to the vena cava. Takes about a minute for the full circulatory process to happen. It leaves the heart, it comes back to the right side, goes through the lungs, and then goes out again, back to the right side, through the lungs, out the left side, and so forth. Okay, the pumping action of the heart produces a squeeze and a relax. It's not a continuous pump producing water flow like comes out of your heart. Instead, it pushes it out and then stops, and pushes and then stops. It's what gives you your pulse. You're pushing hard, then relaxing. You're pushing hard and then relaxing. Happens about 60, 70 times a minute at rest. And so that's your cardiac cycle. When the heart, before it beats, it's relaxed so that the pressures inside are low and the blood can come in through the right atrium, from the vena cava into the right atrium, down into the right ventricle. You're drawing blood into the heart during the relaxing phase, which is called diastole. Not diastole, but diastole. And this is, it sounds like relax, diastole. That's the phase of relaxation where the heart is filling. Early diastole, it's starting to relax from its previous squeeze, but it has to drop down pressure enough for anything to start coming in. It takes just a fraction of a second of relaxation before the pressure inside is low enough that blood can come in. That's called isovolumetric relaxation, means no volume change, same volume relaxation period. And then after that, it fills. So it relaxes and then it fills. Then when it squeezes, it has to squeeze for a fraction of a second before the pressure's high enough to push it out the aorta. The aorta has a decent amount of pressure already, and so you have to squeeze for a while before the blood can start going out. So you have a period of isovolumetric contraction, no blood volume change. And then the valves pop open because you've squeezed hard enough, and you have ejection. This is when the blood is leaving the heart and going out to your body. So you relax and then fill. You squeeze and then eject. Relax, fill, squeeze, eject. It's kind of a four-part system. Here we have what's going on. Here's all of your all of your pressure and volume curves. Here's the pressure in the ventricle. When the pressure goes up, the volume goes down because you're squeezing blood out. And then the pressure starts going down, the volume goes back up again. We'll look at these curves separately so you can see them easier. Right now it's too complicated to look at. But here are the phases. You're filling, and then you get a little bit more blood from the atria squeeze, a little bit right before the ventricle squeeze, then the ventricle squeeze, then the blood goes out, and then, you start relaxing, and then it fills again, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So that's what's going on inside the heart at each of these phases. Now, this is your most commonly tested curve. This is your left ventricular pressure curve. Now, your right ventricle looks like this too, but the pressure isn't as high. Your right ventricle isn't as strong. It produces pressures of like 25 millimeters of mercury, whereas this is 120/80, remember, is your blood pressure. That's your left side blood pressure, pumping blood out your aorta into your main vessels in your body. So this 120 up here tells you that this is your left ventricle we're looking at. Okay, before you squeeze, the pressure's really low. That allows blood to come in. Right before your squeeze, remember, the atria contract and then the ventricles, so it goes. So you get a squeeze on the top, pushes the rest of the blood into the ventricles before they squeeze, okay? So you get a little bit of pressure in the ventricles just from the squeeze of those. They're weak. Atria aren't very strong, but the blood that was coming in, you get a little bit more. Then the ventricle squeezes, and it snaps the AV valve shut, because those were letting blood come in from the atria, and you don't want it to go back up into the atria. So as soon as the ventricles squeeze, the AV valves go snap, and you get your first heart sound. Then you build up pressure, build up pressure, build up pressure, build up pressure. This is isovolumetric contraction right here. And then suddenly you pop open the outflow valves, the semilunar valves, and blood starts going out. Come on, where's my cursor? So blood, this is the ejection phase right here. Your AV valves are still closed because you don't want blood going backwards up into the atria. But now the outflow valves, the aortic and pulmonary valves, are open and blood is leaving the heart. Then those guys snap shut. These guys shut. And you relax a while, and then finally the AV valves flop open and more blood starts coming in from the atria. First it falls in. You get a little bit of atrial squeeze, and then you squeeze again. So you fill atria, ventricles. Fill atria, ventricles. Okay, so here we have isovolumetric contraction, ejection, relaxation, filling. And what you're actually trying to do here is create enough pressure in the ventricle to push some blood into the aorta. See, here's your aortic pressure out here. It's dropping down because the blood is leaving between beats and going out to your body. And then before it gets too low, this pressure from the from the ventricle, opens the aortic valve and pushes blood into the aorta. And then it starts dropping again, and then you push more in, and you push more in. And that's where you can feel your pulse. It drops down and then up, and then drops down and then up. And it's caused by the ventricular pressure getting high enough to open the aortic valve and push blood out into the aorta. And then it drops down again. These are your atrial pressures. They stay pretty low. I'm not going to ask questions on atrial pressures. Ventricle's good enough. So here's also a fairly common diagram. It's not as complicated as it looks. Here is if you had zero blood and pressure in your heart, which never happens if you're alive. But here we're starting out at a kind of a low pressure here, and we're going to fill the ventricle. So we're getting volume without the pressure changing much. Tiny bit of pressure just because of the weight of the blood. But we're filling the left ventricle, then we squeeze a little bit, and then we eject. And then we relax enough to start filling, and then we squeeze and eject. We relax and fill and squeeze and reject. Isovolumetric relaxation, filling, isovolumetric contraction, ejection. Now this ugly looking thing out here, this is the limits of your chamber. So when you start exercising, you squeeze harder, you get more blood, you push more blood, and this box here could get this big. That's what that is. Okay? I won't ask you specifically about this. I'm mainly concerned about the phases of what's happening. Therefore, I got rid of the rest and just drew this one for you. And here we are, we're relaxing from the last beat, and now we fill. Then we squeeze, and then we eject. How can you tell what's going on? Well, here you're gaining volume with no real pressure change. That means you're filling. Now you're gaining pressure, but no volume change. That's the definition of isovolumetric contraction. Now you're losing volume, but the pressure is pretty high, so you're ejecting, you're blowing the blood out. Now we're gaining, we're losing pressure, but there's no volume change. That's isovolumetric relaxation. Relax until you can fill, and then squeeze until you can eject. So what you accomplish is putting blood in the aorta, which is your whole point of this, is to take it out of the vena cava, pull it out of the vena cava, and ram it into the aorta so you've got blood pressure. Okay, so here's the aortic pressure. You know, it got up as high as 120, and it's dropping down to about 80. About that time, the ventricular pressure is building up. It opens the aortic valve, and you shove some more blood into the ventricle. The ventricular pressure goes up, and then it drops down until the heart beats again, and then it goes up, and then it drops down until the heart beats again, and it goes up. So this is the pressure right here, between here and here, that your heart is adding to the aorta. So it's called your pulse pressure. It is the pressure that produces your pulse. It takes you from your diastolic pressure at relaxation to your systolic pressure at squeeze. Diastolic pressure, systolic pressure. The difference between the two is your pulse pressure. It's just how much you add it. So if you started at 80, you add 40 to get to 120. So your pulse pressure here is 40 millimeters of mercury. Now this little guy here is a kind of an interesting anomaly, because when you start relaxing the heart and you snap the aortic valve shut, the blood you were pushing out in the stretchy aorta recoils back against that valve and makes a little spike of pressure, and also creates that second heart sound. Remember, the first heart sound happened when the AV valve snapped shut, when the first heart first began squeezing. After it squeezes it out, it starts to relax, and these valves snap shut and make the second heart sound. So it goes lub-dub, lub-dub. First heart sound, second heart sound. First heart sound, second heart sound. We'll talk about that even more in a little bit. But that little bounce back of the blood against the aortic valve creates what's called the dicrotic notch. The dicrotic notch. And so your pressure doesn't just go smoothly down to diastole. Instead, it goes up and then down. And it goes up and then down. The dicrotic notch is this little jump here that's caused by that blood recoil. Okay, so your pulse pressure is just from systole to from diastole to systole. It's the difference between the two. So if it's 80 and then this is 120, then your pulse pressure is 40. Okay. Another calculation that you'll need to do is to calculate what's called the mean arterial pressure. And this means basically the average arterial pressure in your big blood vessels, like your aorta and your large blood vessels, where you would take your blood pressure. Because if somebody is sick or they bled out and you're trying to give them some more blood pressure, you don't say, well, I'm trying to get the systolic to go up or the diastolic to go up, or blah, blah, blah. Instead, you say, well, the average blood pressure is about this, and after I gave them an infusion of blood transfusion of a pint of blood, their average pressure went up. And it's a very commonly used term, the mean arterial blood pressure. Now, it'd be really easy if you could just split the difference, right? 120 over 80, halfway there would be, it'd be 100. 100. Okay, just be halfway in between. But you don't get to do that because your heart is in relaxation 2/3 of the time, and it's only squeezing 1/3 of the time. So you could, instead of going halfway up to find your average blood pressure, you go 1/3 of the way up. So it makes it a tiny bit more complicated. What you do is you take here and you go 1/3 of the way to there. So it is diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of your pulse pressure. It's just 1/3 of the way up from here to here. Now, the good thing is, on a test, I will give you numbers that are real easy to divide by 3. What if I said, 150 over 90? I said your person's blood pressure is 150 over 90. They have at least early stage hypertension. They're 150 over 90. Well, what is the pulse pressure? 60, right? 150, 90. 150 minus 90 is 60. From 90 to 150 is 60. 60 is your pulse pressure. But what's easy is now it's easy to divide 60 by 3, right? To get 1/3. It's 20. So 150 over 90 is 60. 1/3 of that is 20. So you take 90 plus 20 is 110. Okay? If I did 125 over 80. Okay, that's 80 to 125 is 45. Well, what is 45 divided by 3? It's 15. You can do that in your head. And I'll even let you use a calculator on the test just to be sure, because everybody gets all freaky and thinks, oh my God, math. Okay, 45 divided by 3 is 15. But you can even use so you would have 125 over 90. Your pulse pressure would be 45. So you would add 125 over 80. 125 over 80. Your pulse pressure would be 45. And so you just take 80 and add 15, and your mean arterial pressure would then be 95. 125 over 80. The pulse pressure is the difference between 80 and 125. That's 45. So 80 plus 1/3 of that, 80 plus 15 is 95. That would be your mean arterial pressure. You will have to do that on the test. I'll give you some basic numbers for a person, and you're going to have to say what their systolic pressure is, their diastolic pressure, their mean arterial pressure, their pulse pressure. It's real easy calculation. Just practice it a few times. So typical arterial pressures are, for your systemic side, the left side, which has a lot of pressure in it, about 120 over 80, 120 over 70, depends on who you're talking to. 120 over 70 is better. Okay, 120 over 80, a lot of people use. What is your pulse pressure here? 30 and 20, 50. 70 to 120 is 50. 120 minus 70 is 50. However you want to get there. Okay, so pulse pressure there would be 50 millimeters of mercury. So systolic minus diastolic would be 50. Mean arterial pressure would be 70 plus 1/3 of 50. Well, a third of 50 is kind of a pain, but you could do it with a calculator. That's why I give you better numbers than that. But just so you remember what that is. Your pulmonary blood pressure is much lower. That's the right side of your heart. The muscle's not as strong. All it has to do is pump blood through your lungs. They don't resist very much, so you don't need much pressure. So your blood pressure on the pulmonary side is like 25/15 instead of 120/80 or 120/70. So, what's the point of adding pressure? It's so you can squirt blood out. So your cardiac output, which is quantity per minute, the little dot means per minute. Now, very rarely I put the dot there because my computer won't do that. I had to put a text box with a period in it and move it over there. Okay? Q dot. The dot always means per minute. So the quantity of blood per minute, sometimes it's written as CO for cardiac output, because by context you know that we don't mean carbon monoxide, cardiac output. But the Q dot equals the stroke volume, which is the amount of blood that goes out with each beat, times how many beats you have per minute. That's a pretty straightforward concept too. If I beat 100 times a minute and I have a cup per beat, that's 100 cups of water, 100 cups of blood, or whatever. Okay? So all you do is take the size of your stroke and divide it and multiply it by the number of beats per minute, and you'll get cardiac output. That's another thing you'll have to do on the test. Just take stroke volume and heart rate and multiply them. Again, I'll give you numbers you can do in your head, but you'll have a calculator if you need it. So you can increase Q dot, cardiac output per minute, by either increasing heart rate or stroke volume. Like if you speed your heart out, you're going to put out more blood. If you squeeze harder, you're going to put out more blood. What actually happens in a healthy heart is you do both. During exercise, your heart speeds up and it squeezes harder, so you push more blood out. We also, as we'll talk more when we get to the blood vessels, we will decrease the amount of pressure the heart's fighting against. Because if it's beating faster and squeezing harder, if you can relax the blood vessels at the other end, the blood goes out easier. And that increases cardiac output as well. It's called afterload. You're decreasing afterload, the load that the heart is fighting against after it beats. And that's by decreasing the pressure of the veins, arteries mainly, and arterioles by relaxing them so the blood flows more easily. Peripheral resistance. So, if I want to, first of all, my resting heart rate, let's say I have a resting heart rate of 70 beats a minute. That is because my SA node that we talked about, that, it sends a signal and then it goes through the atria and it hits the AV node and it fires and sends the signal down into the ventricles, down the bundle of His and all that stuff, okay? So your heart rate is basically determined by the SA node. That's your pacemaker. Your pacemaker has an intrinsic firing rate. That means it will fire a certain number of times a minute, even if nobody stimulates it. Remember, it has that diastolic depolarization, and then it fires on its own, and then it depolarizes and fires again. But it's actually the intrinsic firing rate of an SA node is set at about 100 beats a minute. What we have are the vagus nerves, which is our primary parasympathetic nerves, which you remember from last semester, and they slow your heart rate. So your vagus nerves suppress the rate of the SA node, so you have a resting heart rate of 70 instead of 100, which is a lot better. When you exercise train and you get really fit, then your resting heart rate is lower. And that's because the vagus nerves send out more powerful signals and it slows your resting heart rate down even more. So the resting heart rate is your intrinsic firing rate of the SA node with suppression by the vagus nerves. So what happens if you want to speed your heart rate up during exercise? Okay? Well, first of all, you would have to withdraw that vagal stimulation, so you quit slowing it down. But then you're also going to have some major stimulation by sympathetic nerves and hormones and stuff that are going to speed it up. Sympathetic nervous system on the heart turns on beta-1 receptors, which let more calcium in the SA node so that it beats faster, lets it in quicker, and it lets more calcium go in the heart muscle cells so they squeeze harder. Calcium squeezes harder. Calcium makes muscle squeeze harder. Makes the heart beat faster, makes the heart beat harder. It does everything. Okay, so sympathetic stimulation of the beta-1 receptors by your, wow, this is hard to see, by the sympathetic nervous system and hormonal epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, hormonal norepinephrine, epinephrine, okay, is going to stimulate the beta-1 receptors in the SA node, also speeds up the AV node. So it causes an increase in heart rate. Okay, this is called a chronotropic effect. A chronograph is a watch, a clock. So clock stimulating, effect would make your heart go faster. So an increased chronotropic stimulation would mean your heart is speeding up due to the sympathetic nerves and sympathetic stimulation by circulating hormones. Another thing that will stimulate your heart to beat faster, the first thing you normally think of is that sympathetic stimulation makes your heart speed up and squeeze harder. But also, during rest, a lot of your blood is hanging out in your veins because you don't need it all during rest. As soon as you start exercising, all of your muscles squeeze those blood vessels and shoves the blood back to the heart. This extra blood that comes back into the heart stretches the right atrium, and our right atrium will sense that increased blood coming into the right atrium and cause the heart to speed up. So we're looking at an increase of venous return. Sympathetic stimulation causes blood vessels to squeeze. The muscle pump of your muscles squishing on the blood vessels makes the blood come back to the heart faster. The respiratory pump, when you breathe really deep, you lower the pressure around the heart because it's right where the lungs are, and that pulls blood toward the heart. So all of these things stimulate the increase in venous return of blood to the heart, and it invokes this stretch reflex on the right atrium that's called the Bainbridge reflex. The Bainbridge reflex senses that increased stretch of the right atrium, sends signals to the SA node to speed it up. Bainbridge reflex increases heart rate when you get more blood into the heart. Now, stroke volume is going to increase too in two ways. You're going to take in more blood and you're going to squeeze harder. So how are we going to do that? Well, increase venous return, your sympathetics and your squeezing of the blood vessels with your muscles, your respiratory pump, they're sucking more blood back to your heart. It stretches the right atrium and makes it beat faster. But there's also more blood now going in the ventricle because there's more blood. So it stretches out the ventricles with this extra blood. So now you have more blood to push Your bucket is fuller. But you've got to stimulate the heart to squeeze harder to push all that blood out. Okay, so that's what's going to happen here. Our end diastolic volume, which is the volume at the end of relaxation when you finish filling all you can, is going to get bigger because there's more blood going in. End systolic volume is what's left after you squeezed as hard as you could. Systole, at the end of systole, you have the smallest volume in there. So if you put in more and then you squeeze out more, you're going to have a bigger stroke volume. Okay, so your stroke volume is the difference. If this gets bigger and this gets smaller, then the difference gets huge and you push out more blood with each stroke. The other thing that increases is the percentage of blood that you push out. And this is a really important concept. This is called ejection fraction. Ejection fraction, or EF. And this is the percentage of available blood that gets ejected. Let's say you have a cup of blood in your heart in diastole. You have a cup, and at the end you have a half a cup. Okay, then you squeezed out 50%. You squeezed out half of it. What if you only have a third of it left at the end? Then you squeezed out 66%. 0.6666. Okay? So your ejection fraction just tells you how much of that available blood actually got squeezed out. The better you squeeze, the better your heart muscle's working. During exercise, you squeeze harder. You get more calcium in there. Sympathetic stimulation. Ejection fraction goes up. So you're looking to squeeze out at least 50% at rest and better during exercise. Should get up, 60, 70, even 80% ejection fraction during exercise. You're squeezing harder and getting more of it out. The ejection fraction, when it drops, is an indication of heart failure. If your heart is only getting out about, 35, 30%, you're in heart failure. You're not squeezing hard enough to get a decent amount of blood out. I've seen heart failure patients with ejection fractions of around 18%. It didn't look like their heart was squeezing at all. It just kind of twitched. If you look at it under an image, it just didn't have enough strength to push the blood out. Factors increasing stroke volume are the same ones that increase the heart rate. Sympathetic from the nerves and the hormones. So you're stimulating these beta-1 receptors, except for heart rate, you stimulate them on the SA node because that controls your heart rate. Now you're going to stimulate them on the myocardium, the muscle of the heart muscle cells. When you put more calcium inside, this is called an inotropic effect, because these are ionotropic, some people call it ionotropic, but the true term is inotropic. It means you're putting more ions in, more calcium ions, squeezes harder, squeezes more firmly, and you squeeze out more blood, so you increase cardiac output. So if you put calcium in the SA node, beta-1 receptors, it speeds the heart up. If you put more calcium in and that's a chronotropic effect, speed, chronograph. If you put the calcium inside the heart muscle cells, the ionotropic effect or inotropic effect, you'll squeeze harder. And whether you get your epinephrine and norepinephrine from your nerves or as hormones from the adrenal gland, both cases, you squeeze harder. Okay, so we had venous return gave us more blood because you're exercising now, and now you stimulate it, so you squeeze harder, so you squeeze more of it out. And then the same factor that causes your heart to speed up when you get more venous return, the Bainbridge reflex, remember, it stretched the right atrium, so your right atrium stimulates the SA node to beat faster. if you stretch the ventricle, you initiate what's called the Starling reflex, because this guy named Starling, who we'll see in a few different places because he was a big physiologist back around 1900 or so. Anyway, Starling discovered that if you increase ventricle filling, the ventricles automatically squeeze harder, even if they're not stimulated with hormones or anything. Just stretching it more makes it recoil better. And this is in a healthy heart. It has to be healthy to have this response. But what it does is it moves the actin and myosin filaments in those cardiac cells into a more optimal position so that they have more cross bridges and can squeeze better. So Bainbridge reflex speeds up the heart. The Starling reflex makes it beat harder. Okay? Almost without limit in a healthy heart. If you put more blood in a healthy heart, it'll squeeze harder. And you get the Starling reflex. Here we have, as in diastolic volume increases, stroke volume increases, because you get more blood in, but you also are pushing it out better. So cardiac output then increases in cardiac output combines all effects. Remember, your resting cardiac output, your resting heart rate, is that intrinsic firing of the SA node suppressed by the vagus nerves down to a normal resting heart rate. During exercise, you remove the vagus suppression and you add sympathetics. The vagus is parasympathetic. Fight or flight, sympathetic. Speeds up the heart, makes it squeeze harder. You get more blood into the heart. Bainbridge reflex speeds it up. Starling reflex makes it squeeze harder. And see, I put CO here instead of Q. Increases both heart rate and stroke volume. So your resting cardiac output typically around 5 liters per minute in the average person. But during exercise, it can easily go up to 20 liters per minute. That's a lot more. Your heart's beating faster and it's squeezing harder. And the other wrinkle is, what's it doing this all for? It's not to give you more food to your cells. They get enough at rest. As a matter of fact, rest and digest is when they do their best eating. Increased cardiac output is to increase oxygen delivery and CO2 removal. It's all about gas exchange to keep up with your exercise. So when you exercise, the whole point of this extra cardiac output is to increase oxygen delivery to the tissues that need it. Leg muscles, arm muscles, depending on what you're exercising. So what you're really looking for is how much blood is going there, but also how much oxygen is being sucked out of the blood that goes by. So the amount of oxygen being consumed by your whole body, if you look at the whole thing, or by your leg, if you're just looking at that, is the stroke volume, the amount that goes in per beat, times heart rate, in other words, cardiac output, how much blood is going through, times the extraction of oxygen. And this isn't as bad as it looks. This is just the difference in oxygen between the arteries going in and the veins coming out. Arterial venous oxygen difference. If it goes in with 100 and comes out at 40, then the extraction was 60. If it goes in at 100 and comes out at 20, the extraction was 80. And during exercise, your muscles extract oxygen more efficiently from the blood that's going by. So not only are you increasing the heart rate and the stroke volume to give more blood, but you're increasing the suck out of the oxygen of the blood that goes by. The difference between the arteries and the veins, or AVO2 difference, increases, And this is called the Fick equation. If you see it when you get into nursing school or something, that's what they're talking about. It's cardiac output times oxygen extraction equals total oxygen that got used up. You know, how much went in, how much came out. The difference is what you used. And so, especially skeletal muscle is really good at using all three of these to increase oxygen during exercise. More blood and greater extraction. Okay, so let's do another little topic here or two on what's going on when the heart is doing all of this stuff. We have our heart sounds, sound 1 and sound 2, S1 and S2. Lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. That's what they call them. Like they want to describe it. Lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. The first heart sound is created when the heart first begins to squeeze at the very beginning of systole, and it causes the AV valves to snap shut so the blood doesn't go back up in the atria. S1 is the closure of the AV valves and the blood bouncing against them and making a little bit of a vibration, and that's what you actually hear. So it's the closure of the AV valves gives you S1. When your heart starts to relax and the blood stops going out of the semilunar valves, they snap shut. The blood bounces against them and makes another little sound that you can hear. So it's AV valves make S1, outflow valves, the semilunar valves, aortic and pulmonary valves that make S2. Lub dub, lub dub. S1, AV valves, S2, aortic and pulmonary valves. Great. Here's what they look like on an echo system that actually gives you, it's like a voice print of these sounds. Here we have bum bum, bum bum, bum bum, bum bum. You can potentially have a third and fourth heart sound. Generally, they are abnormal sounds in somebody that has a heart that has gotten hard, it's overstretched, and it has the ability to create additional sounds. We'll talk about those more in pathophysiology, or you'll learn about them in pathophysiology or in the nursing program. Here are some heart murmurs. And a heart murmur is if you have a valve that doesn't close all the way and blood can squirt back through it. That's called an insufficiency or regurgitation. It's squirting back in the opposite direction and making a noise while it does it. If a valve doesn't open wide enough to let the blood go through smoothly to begin with, that's called stenosis. Stenosis of any tube means it's narrowed and doesn't let stuff go through the way it should. So think about what could make it sound. If I go, you can hardly hear that. That would be a good heart sound. But what if it's closed and it goes, it makes more noise, it's stenosis, it's squirting through, it's making a greater sound. So here we have a couple of different types of murmurs. Right after you squeeze and get your first heart sound, if the aortic valve doesn't open all the way, the blood going through it makes a lot of noise. And the aortic stenosis is especially recognizable, and you almost surely in the nursing program or other programs will have to identify this. This is called a crescendo-decrescendo sound because it goes aortic stenosis. Right after the first heart sound, it goes, and that means the aortic valve hasn't opened all the way and it's making noise going through it. Now these other ones are more like They're not a crescendo, decrescendo. They're not as loud a sound. And this mitral regurgitation, so this would happen if the mitral valve doesn't close all the way. So when the left ventricle is squeezing, it's trying to push it out the aorta, but part of it's squirting back up into the left atrium. Makes a little bit of noise. Aortic regurg. Between beats, there's blood squirting back through the aortic valve. So it would be after the second heart sound when it's supposed to close. Instead, it's going so that would be a aortic regurg murmur. And here's one that's interesting, and we'll talk about it later when we talk about fetal hearts and babies' hearts, neonates' hearts. The ductus arteriosus is a blood vessel between the right and left side of the heart during fetalhood that lets the blood go straight across because it doesn't have to go through the lungs. So it comes back to the heart, and instead of going to the lungs, it just goes across into the aorta and goes out to the baby's body. It's coming back from the umbilical cord, so it's plenty oxygenated. It just goes across and then, goes out to the baby's body. But as soon as you're born, that's supposed to close, so the blood is forced to go through your lungs to get oxygenated. If this ductus arteriosus doesn't close, it's considered patent or still active, still working. A patent ductus arteriosus means one that's still open. And you'll be able to hear the blood continuously going from across where it's not supposed to be going. So it's going patent ductus arteriosus. And finally, a splitting of heart sounds happens when the valves, the AV valves or the outflow valves don't close at the same time. Generally, the whole bottom of the heart squeezes at the same time. Both valves snap shut and it goes bump. All you hear is one thing. But if something causes them to close at a different time, it goes ba-dum, ba-dum. And so if, for instance, if you have left side heart failure, if you're in heart failure, your left side doesn't squeeze as hard as it should. The right side closes too early compared to the left side, and it goes ba-dum, ba-dum. If on the outflow, you're pushing the blood out, and when you start to relax, let's say you have pulmonary hypertension, extra pressure on that side closes that pulmonary valve too soon, and it goes ba-dum. So if you have a splitting of S1, it means the AV valves are asynchronous. So it's ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum. If you have a splitting of S2, it means the outflow valves aren't closing at the same time. Bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum. And you just listen and hear which one it is, and you'll know that there's either a problem with the pressures or valves in the top or the pressure on the valves in the bottom. Splitting of S1 would be at the very beginning, left side failure, sometimes a bundle branch block that doesn't let the signal go down into the ventricles at the same speed. So one of them gets the signal first and closes asynchronously. S2, it's usually pulmonary hypertension, which means the pulmonary valve closes too soon because the pressures out there are too high. And that's it for Heart as a Pump.